In a moment that shook the royal inner circle, Prince Edward issued an executive freeze on Camilla's family, cutting them off from the Royal Foundation Board in a move no one saw coming. Or something far more personal. Whispers echo through the corridors as loyalties snap and old alliances shatter. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The announcement came without warning. From Edward's private office at Windsor, a formal notice was dispatched to the Foundation's trustees just after dawn. It was brief, precise, and delivered with the kind of authority that demanded silence, not response. The word freeze was used deliberately, and it sent a shockwave across every royal channel. Not suspend, not review, freeze. An immediate and absolute halt to any influence, participation, or presence of Camilla's family within the Foundation's affairs. For many, it felt like a purge masquerading as protocol. Even seasoned courtiers, well acquainted with the House of Windsor's undercurrents, were left stunned. This wasn't just administrative reshuffling, it was a statement. Camilla's relatives, once mere spectators, had, over time, accumulated influence across several Foundation subcommittees. Their hands were seen in everything from grant approvals to high-profile charity alignments. Invitations bore their names, initiatives bore their preferences. And yet, with a single decision, Edward erased it all. What raised eyebrows even more was the route Edward took. Traditionally, such actions would pass through the monarch if not for approval, then at least as a matter of courtesy. But Prince Edward didn't consult King Charles. Sources close to Clarence House confirmed that Charles learned of the freeze only after the official communication had already been distributed. That break in royal procedure wasn't oversight, it was intentional, and it spoke volumes. Within hours of the announcement, the internal backlash was swift. Several advisors to the Foundation, especially those with ties to Camilla's circle, either resigned or were asked to step back indefinitely. Emergency calls flooded Windsor, but Edward refused to reverse the directive. He didn't soften. He didn't explain. He simply moved forward, issuing a second internal memo reinforcing the freeze and warning against unofficial lobbying. Meanwhile, digital traces began to vanish. The Royal Foundation's official site quietly updated its board listing. Camilla's family, once proudly displayed among the contributors and strategists, were suddenly absent. Their biographies scrubbed, their portraits removed, their names no longer linked to any current initiative. It was a digital execution of reputations, carried out with royal precision. Insiders whisper that this is not just about board seats or influence. This was a statement of legacy, loyalty, and who truly belongs at the heart of the monarchy's mission. And for Prince Edward, it was a turning point, a declaration that some names, regardless of blood or marriage, would not be allowed to steer the soul of the crown. But what could provoke Prince Edward to strike so surgically and so suddenly? To find that answer, we must go back to a scandal buried beneath royal decorum. Behind polite smiles and public appearances lies a history of bitterness. Edward and Camilla have long danced around each other in the shadows of royal power, but insiders claim their rivalry dates back to the early 2000s, ignited by betrayal, exclusion, and one unforgettable confrontation behind palace walls. It all began with a snub, subtle but sharp. When Camilla officially joined the royal family after her marriage to Charles, her inner circle expanded rapidly. Lavish dinners, weekend retreats, exclusive events, the invitations went out widely, but one name was conspicuously missing from many of them: Prince Edward. It wasn't just a matter of oversight. According to multiple palace aides, Edward was intentionally kept at a distance, seen by Camilla's camp as non-essential to the new royal brand she was building. The exclusion didn't go unnoticed. While the public saw polite nods and shared balcony appearances, behind closed doors, Edward simmered. The rift deepened after the death of the Queen Mother, when inheritance talks began to fracture the family's already fragile alliances. Rumours swirled that Camilla's influence over Charles tilted the balance of certain estate distributions, and while never confirmed, Edward was said to have felt sidelined. His belief that certain heirlooms and privileges rightfully belonged to his branch of the family led to cold, silent standoffs during family gatherings. Whispers grew louder in 2011 when a leaked letter believed to be written by Edward circulated briefly before vanishing from public view. In it, he reportedly referred to Camilla's entitled entourage and accused them of acting like courtiers without crowns. It was a harsh assessment, one that hinted at how deeply the resentment ran. That same year, the tension burst into the open during a royal event when a disagreement over patronage lists led to a public misstep. Camilla introduced a charitable initiative that Edward had previously declined, and the resulting overlap created an awkward moment on stage one, caught by the press and magnified tenfold behind the scenes. Sophie Wessex, Edward's wife, often found herself caught between the feuding forces. On more than one occasion, Sophie reportedly acted as a mediator, diffusing tension with grace but growing wearier with each confrontation. For years, the rivalry remained quiet, contained beneath royal protocol and tightly controlled public relations. But it never disappeared, it festered. And behind every icy glance and forced smile, the distance between Edward and Camilla widened. No one dared to name it aloud, but the palace knew. They knew the day would come when civility would crack and retribution would rise. But tension alone doesn't explain Edward's bold move. A turning point came when Camilla's family stepped far beyond their ceremonial roles. Camilla's relatives were once guests at royal events, but over the last year, they became gatekeepers, controlling funding pipelines, influencing cause selection, and reshaping the foundation's tone. What began as quiet involvement turned into full-scale influence, and that's when Edward began to plot. It didn't happen overnight. First came the whispered suggestions, the casual recommendations, the insider advice, passed off as harmless engagement. But soon, Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's daughter and son, went from occasional attendees to power brokers within the royal foundation. Insiders revealed they were given what amounted to informal veto power over board agendas. Projects that didn't align with their personal or social interests were quietly shelved, while preferred causes leapt ahead in funding priority without proper scrutiny. It was subtle, it was strategic, and it was deeply unsettling for those who understood the foundation's original vision. What unnerved Edward most wasn't just the maneuvering, it was the way traditions were brushed aside in the process. For generations, royal foundations operated on the bedrock of discretion, duty, and legacy. But now, proposals bypassed traditional vetting protocols. Catherine, known for her meticulous preparation and cautious decision-making, reportedly raised an eyebrow when her own initiatives were repeatedly held up with vague excuses and redirected support. She didn't confront, she observed. And Edward noticed. Then came the leaks. Anonymous foundation staff members began sounding the alarm, reporting internal meetings where personal connections, not merit, dictated funding direction. Conflict of interest discussions were swept under plush palace carpets. The board, once guided by royal impartiality, was now being directed by a shadow circle with no official mandate. Camilla, it seemed, had convinced Charles that her family's input was not just valuable, it was essential. And Charles, always eager to keep peace at home, offered little resistance. But Edward wasn't so easily swayed. To him, this wasn't about modernizing or broadening influence, it was a hostile takeover dressed in family ties. He saw the shift not as evolution, but erosion, and it struck a deep, personal chord. The foundation was one of the last remaining institutions still tied to Queen Elizabeth's moral code, and Edward believed that code was being dismantled with alarming speed. One anonymous senior advisor put it bluntly. He felt the board had become Camilla's court. In private, Edward's patience wore thin. Meetings became tense, communication faltered, and icy silences replaced ceremonial courtesies. But he didn't explode. He waited. He watched. And then, quietly, he began to gather his own information. Because while the boardroom was under siege by influence and favoritism, Edward was about to receive something that would turn whispers into war. While palace aides tried to keep the tension under wraps, a secret dossier landed on Edward's desk and it would change everything. An anonymous whistleblower within the Foundation compiled a dossier of internal emails, backdoor dealings, and unsettling donations. The moment Prince Edward read its contents, something inside him snapped. This was no longer about rivalry, this was about protecting the very soul of the monarchy. The dossier arrived in a nondescript envelope, slid beneath the door of Edward's private study. Inside was a 67-page report that would unravel the polished illusion of order within the Royal Foundation. It didn't accuse it exposed. It laid bare a web of favoritism so intricate and blatant that even Edward, long versed in palace politics, was stunned. What he read was not just political miscalculation, it was deliberate, coordinated, and deeply corrosive to the monarchy's integrity. The report detailed systematic, back-channel lobbying by individuals with close ties to Camilla's side of the family. Every page whispered betrayal, and by the time he reached the end, Edward wasn't shocked, he was enraged. The most damning sections traced donations from obscure firms with connections to a boutique PR agency owned by one of Camilla's cousins. These firms, under the guise of charitable support, appeared to receive preferential treatment in return high-level introductions, access to events, and media visibility that would typically require years of royal association. But worse still were the signs of internal manipulation. Edward found evidence that charitable funds had been quietly redirected into vanity projects, with little oversight or evaluation initiatives that bore Camilla's family name more than they carried royal purpose. These weren't just conflicts of interest, they were red flags of corruption hiding beneath a crown. Buried within the email threads was another revelation. Camilla's nephew had been issuing informal directives to the Royal Foundation's press office. His messages outlined preferred talking points, suggested phrasing, and in some cases, even overrode previously agreed statements. A line from one email chilled Edward. "Let's make sure the narrative reflects our tone. Our tone. Not the crown's, not the royal family's. Ours." It was more than overreach, it was occupation. Perhaps the most striking moment in the report came from a senior official within the Foundation who, in an internal memo, wrote, "This is no longer a foundation, it's a fiefdom." That single sentence became the catalyst for what came next. Edward didn't hesitate. He didn't consult a team. He didn't weigh consequences. He moved. Within hours, he called for a discreet internal review and ordered a complete shutdown of the Foundation's external engagements pending re-evaluation. The freeze wasn't announced yet, but the machinery was already grinding to a halt. But Edward wasn't acting blindly. For all his fury, he knew what he was about to do would shake the monarchy to its core, and before he made his move, Edward needed a final push, a royal ally whose voice carried unmatched moral weight. While the men of the monarchy made headlines, it was Sophie Wessex who cornered Prince Edward in a rare emotional plea. Her words weren't loud, but they cut deep. She told him what others wouldn't. She gave him permission to act. And she warned him of the consequences if he didn't. For weeks, Sophie had remained composed, watching the unraveling of the Royal Foundation with quiet concern. But behind that calm exterior was a woman who knew far more than she let on. Through private conversations with junior staff and hushed admissions from senior aides, Sophie had pieced together the same unsettling picture Edward now held in his hands. She hadn't seen the dossier, but she didn't need to. The whispers, the warnings, the uncomfortable silences around her told her enough. She knew the rot was spreading, and she knew time was running out. It was in the garden of their Bagshot Park residence, far from cameras, far from courtiers, that Sophie finally broke. After a long walk in silence, she stopped Edward beneath the old cedar tree they often passed without thought. But this time, she didn't move on. She turned, and with a voice trembling not with fear, but with urgency, she said the words he hadn't allowed himself to consider out loud. "You can't wait for Charles. You have to move." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration, a warning, a final chance to prevent the monarchy's moral compass from collapsing under the weight of corruption and cowardice. That moment, by all accounts, changed Edward. Sophie spoke of the royal charter, of its integrity, its symbolism, and how its decay would mark not just failure but betrayal. She feared that within months, the foundation would lose the trust of the Crown's partners. Not in scandal, in silence, in the slow, public erosion of purpose. But it was her invocation of Queen Elizabeth that pierced deepest. "She trusted you to preserve her legacy," Sophie whispered. "Don't let them rewrite it behind your back." Edward stood still for a long time. No rebuttal, no defense, just silence. And Sophie, ever the one who soothed the wounds of duty, let that silence settle between them. That night, Edward said little, but those closest to him noticed the change. His voice, once cautious in staff meetings, became direct. His tone, once diplomatic, turned deliberate. No more deflection, no more delays. He was done waiting. He knew what had to be done. He knew it wouldn't be forgiven. But Sophie had made the unspoken speakable, and in doing so, had given him the moral clarity to act without hesitation. In that final, fragile moment beneath the cedar, she had become his conscience. And by morning, that conscience would guide his most decisive move yet. The following morning, with dawn barely breaking, Prince Edward picked up the phone and made the call that would rock the palace. At 5:07 a.m., Prince Edward called Clarence House not to consult, but to inform. Charles didn't answer. Camilla did. What was said during that icy 5-minute exchange remains private, but what followed was a royal power tremor felt from Balmoral to Buckingham. The phone rang only twice before it was answered. There was no secretary, no aide, just Camilla, sharp, alert, and already on edge. Perhaps she sensed the moment was coming. Perhaps she knew too much had been taken for granted. But what she heard next wasn't a plea for permission or a heads-up on royal protocol. It was a declaration. Edward, calm but unwavering, informed her that he had enacted a full executive freeze on all involvement by her family within the royal foundation. It was done. Not a discussion, not a proposal, a fact. The air reportedly shifted instantly. According to a senior courtier who was nearby, Camilla's voice turned frigid, stripped of her usual charm and casual wit. And then, eerily, it went silent. No outrage, no rebuttal, just an unnerving, cold quiet that spoke volumes. 22 minutes later, the return call came, but it wasn't from Camilla, it was Charles. Still groggy, still processing, the king tried to steady the ground beneath him. He asked for an explanation, maybe even a reconsideration, but Edward stood firm. For the first time in a long time, Charles found himself not the final authority in a royal matter. Edward reportedly told him this was necessary, and it was overdue. There was no shouting, no grand confrontation, just the unmistakable finality of a brother who had made his choice and wasn't looking back. By mid-morning, the wheels had already turned. The official freeze order, reviewed by the Foundation's legal counsel and marked urgent, was signed and sealed. A public statement was drafted with surgical precision. It read as administrative restructuring, but everyone close to the palace understood what it truly meant. This was no reshuffle. It was exile. Quiet, calculated exile. Immediately, access was revoked. Camilla's relatives found their email credentials no longer valid. Scheduled appearances were removed from the Foundation's internal calendar. Staff, once instructed to liaise directly with Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles, were told to redirect all communications to Edward's newly appointed Oversight Committee. Within hours, a royal digital purge had begun. The media was still asleep when the freeze took effect. But the palace was already awake, buzzing with the consequences. Aides scrambled to issue statements. Advisors debated containment. And Edward, composed and resolute, remained unmoved. This wasn't about optics. This was about reclaiming royal order. As the kingdom awoke, stunned headlines flooded the media. But inside the palace, a very different storm was brewing. Camilla has always played the long game, but insiders say this time she exploded. In a closed-door meeting with Charles, she demanded retaliation only to discover the crown itself was more divided than ever. What she thought was influence was crumbling under pressure. The palace walls, built to contain scandal and shield power, couldn't hold back the fury that erupted behind them. Camilla, blindsided by Edward's unprecedented move, summoned an emergency audience with Charles before the sun had fully risen. Her tone was sharper than ever, her demands urgent, unfiltered. Those present in the room said she was livid, not just at Edward's action, but at the humiliating silence that followed. She had expected outrage from the royal family, a unified front of resistance. Instead, she was met with detachment, indifference, and in one devastating moment, outright dismissal. Charles, tired and weary from a night of frantic calls and royal fallout, listened. But when Camilla demanded the freeze be reversed, he didn't flinch. His reply was simple, but final. He did what he thought was right. "I won't undo it." The words hung in the air like a dagger. Camilla's grip on power wasn't slipping, it was plummeting. For years, she had maneuvered her way into the inner sanctum, playing the part of the dutiful consort while quietly consolidating influence. But now, with a single move by Edward, that scaffolding was collapsing, and not even Charles would reach out to steady it. Still determined, Camilla launched a quiet campaign to reassert her control. She called on foundation patrons, some of whom had supported her family's rise within the institution. But this time, they hesitated. Some declined outright, citing the need to respect governance procedures. Others simply didn't respond at all. Camilla wasn't just facing opposition, she was facing abandonment. The silence was strategic, the absence intentional. Catherine's absence from Camilla's scheduled public event that week said more than any statement could. No formal cancellation, no explanation, just a conspicuous space where the Princess of Wales was expected to stand. For Camilla, that silence carried weight. It was a quiet but thunderous signal of where loyalties now rested. And she wasn't alone in feeling the shift. Princess Anne, known for her unshakable duty and blunt manner, reportedly declined an invitation to a high-profile event co-hosted by Camilla's cousin. Her office issued a cold, one-line response. "The Princess Royal will not be attending." It was a spectacle the monarchy had not seen in decades, a queen consort, not removed by scandal, but weakened by resistance. Her hold over the family's inner structure, once firm and absolute, now seemed hollow, propped up by titles rather than trust. And though she still wore the crown beside Charles, the aura of command was slipping from her shoulders. The headlines framed it as a rift, but those inside the palace knew better. It was a reckoning. But the true blow didn't come from Charles. It came from the Foundation's own records, and what they revealed was far darker. Investigative journalists uncovered redacted documents tied to Camilla's family projects, missing money, hidden beneficiaries, and a connection to a luxury estate abroad. Suddenly, Edward's actions looked less like royal politics and more like a desperate act of damage control. The first whisper came from an encrypted email. A respected journalist received a tip from inside the Foundation, someone who had grown tired of the secrecy, the arrogance, and the growing trail of unanswered questions. Attached were fragments of redacted reports, documents that should have been made public in the Foundation's annual review but had been curiously withheld. The missing pages weren't simply errors, they were intentional omissions, masking a paper trail that would soon tear through the monarchy's already shaken walls. The investigation moved quickly. Cross-referenced records traced several significant donations made to shell charities groups with polished mission statements but little operational presence. Following the funds, reporters discovered they had quietly landed in offshore accounts linked to a private firm, one run by a longtime associate of Camilla's cousin. At first, it seemed circumstantial, but then came the signature. On one particularly damning funding request, the name of Camilla's nephew appeared unsigned by royal auditors, stamped only with an internal code. That code matched several transactions which bypassed standard checks entirely. As soon as the leaks hit the newsroom floors, it became clear this was no longer a family spat. This was scandal. A foundation meant to symbolize royal service and compassion had been turned, in part, into a conduit for private benefit. The story was explosive, but the editorial rooms held it for one reason: they were waiting for confirmation. It came within 48 hours, when a second whistleblower stepped forward with internal messages and staff memos. With every revelation, the palace scrambled harder to contain the fallout. Statements were prepared. Lawyers engaged. But the truth was already out. Amid the growing storm, one detail sent shockwaves internally. Prince William, normally removed from Foundation operations, had reportedly requested a private audit weeks before the story broke. His concern, kept quiet even from some senior aides, was rooted in whispers he had heard months earlier. It wasn't a command, it was a precaution. And when news of his quiet intervention surfaced, it became clear this wasn't a smear campaign. This was a reckoning that had been building from within. The press, long starved for access and answers, circled like vultures. Every clipped statement, every delayed press release was met with suspicion. And as the palace clung to its protocols, the narrative slipped from their hands. It was no longer about Edward, or even Camilla. It was about a royal institution cracking under its own weight. The Foundation, once a symbol of unity and benevolence, now stood accused of deception, and with each headline, the Crown's moral authority thinned. But amidst the chaos, one figure emerged, not with vengeance, but with vision, offering a path forward and stunning the monarchy yet again. As silence fell over the palace, Catherine stepped forward, not with condemnation, but with clarity. She proposed a restructured Royal Foundation Board, one stripped of favoritism, anchored in legacy, and future-focused. But her move wasn't just diplomatic, it was the quiet rise of a queen in waiting. The monarchy was still reeling. Camilla's absence from public events had not gone unnoticed. The press buzzed with speculation, aides whispered behind closed doors, and the Foundation teetered on the edge of institutional collapse. That's when Catherine emerged not as a reactionary voice, but as the one person who could restore calm through vision rather than force. She did not arrive with demands or ultimatums, but with a plan. A new governance framework. Clear standards for board appointments, strict term limits, mandatory transparency in financial dealings. It wasn't personal, it was principled. And that's what made it powerful. At the heart of her proposal was a return to Queen Elizabeth II's blueprint for royal charity, modesty, merit, and moral clarity. She emphasized that the monarchy's strength lies not in dominance, but in consistency. Not in proximity to the crown, but in loyalty to its purpose. Her message was clear. This would not be a playground for privilege anymore. This would be a sanctuary of service. The board would be rebuilt, not repopulated with courtiers, but balanced with professionals, ethics officers, and charitable experts who could operate without fear or favor. Prince William, long considered cautious with his public endorsements, broke tradition and gave her his full backing in a rare statement. He referred to Catherine's proposal as the direction our future must take, lending it not only legitimacy but undeniable momentum. For the first time in years, the power dynamic inside the royal family was visibly tilting, and it was tilting in her favor. What stunned observers most wasn't just the plan, it was Edward's reaction. In a move no one expected, he publicly thanked Catherine during the Foundation's restructuring announcement. In his own words, her clarity brought the order we needed. This, from a royal who had just executed one of the boldest power moves in recent monarchy history. It was more than gratitude, it was an acknowledgement of her authority. As for Camilla, she never appeared for the final vote. Her chair was left empty, her absence seen not as coincidence, but as quiet capitulation. And yet, that absence became a statement in itself. One that confirmed what many had suspected, that the reign of backroom influence was over. Royal watchers dubbed this shift the beginning of Catherine's strategic era, where silence speaks louder than spectacle, and reform triumphs over retaliation. And as the dust settles, one question remains. Was this the beginning of a new royal order, or just the calm before an even greater storm? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.